and welcome to Hell on Earth, Appendix 3, Money. I'm Chris Wade.
And I'm Matt Christman.
So throughout this series, we've been discussing how the social and political developments at this time were mutually reinforced by parallel developments in financial practices and technology. Well, today we are going to delve deep into exactly what those economic developments were, how they evolved, and how they impacted this historical era and beyond. And to help us, we are happy to welcome Patrick Wyman to the show. Patrick is the host of the wonderful Tides of History podcast, as well as author of the book, The Verge, Reformation, Renaissance, and 40 Years That Shook the World, which touches on many of these topics. Patrick, welcome to Hell on Earth.
Thank you so much for joining me. This is surprisingly pleasant for hell.
Yes.
Pleasant hell indeed. Shout out John Dolan.
So let's start with some characters we referenced on the main show, but didn't have as much time to get into the details of as we would have liked. The Fugger banking family. I was absolutely delighted to read that one of the earliest historical records of the Fugger family was a terse census note about one of the patriarchs showing up in Augsburg that simply stated in an older Germanic spelling, "Fucker has arrived." Patrick, can you talk us through the arrival of these fuckers on the European scene and how they built their early financial empires and influence?
Yeah, so the Fuggers are fascinating because it's possible to simultaneously overrate them and underrate them in terms of their overall historical importance. It's possible to underrate them in the sense that if you learn a story about the early modern period and the kind of big transitions that we see in this period, you can focus on kings and you can focus on generals and nobles and all of those people, and you can miss the fact that it is Fugger money that drives so many of these big processes that happen in this period, so many of the big kind of headline grabbing things. But it's also possible to overrate them if you are into the story of finance in this period and you're interested in how all of those developments play through. The Fuggers are a big name, but they're actually pretty typical in a lot of ways. They are far from alone in the kind of trajectory that the family takes in terms of the kinds of activities that they're engaged in, even their overall aims. And I mean, this is something I'm sure we'll touch on over the course of the day, but like what they really want is not really to be financiers, it's to be nobles. And to and a lot of them you can kind of see as the generations of the family go on, they're not really all that interested in doing finance and making loans and things like that. They want to like collect libraries and they want to be generals and they want to do all the other things that like high status people are supposed to do in the 16th and 17th centuries. But in terms of their rise, where they come from, the earliest Fuggers that we see are weavers, and they rise through the ranks of the craft organizations, the craft guilds in the city of Augsburg. And this is a time of a big boom in the cloth industry in South Germany. It's generating a lot of profit. These pretty clever cloth makers are also getting into cloth distribution, and as they get into cloth distribution, they start to have excess. They start to have excess capital, so they start loaning the excess capital, and then they start collecting capital from their friends and relatives in the city of Augsburg. And this is a story that's repeated all over the place in South Germany. Augsburg is a particularly well documented example of it, but it also happens in both Frankfurts. It happens in Nuremberg. It happens all over the place here. So there's really, it's not so much Augsburg, it's not so much the Fuggers as it is South Germany as a whole, and all of these cloth merchants who start to branch out from cloth into related financial activities.
So maybe best to think of them as kind of a first among many, or just the most exemplar among many. But also this is funny because, you know, in one of our first appendices and at the very end of our series, you know, we've been talking about England as a phrase that I've loved Matt saying, a petrostate for wool. And but you kind of see that the same, that you know, wool cloth textiles is kind of, you know, in its own way, the oil industry of early pre-modern Europe, you know?
It very much is, because it's perishable, right? It's a perishable good. It is something that you can produce in large quantities. It's something that where you've got a raw material and you've got various processes of improvement to the raw material that happen before you get to a consumer. You've got demand spread all over the continent. You've got concentrated centers of both production and demand in these growing cities. So, I mean, when you think about in the same way as the Industrial Revolution is driven by textiles, all over the world, not just in Western Europe and the United States. This absolutely the same is true of the financial system in the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries.
So they move up from this, textile market through the guilds to transitioning textiles into purely financial products. So once they start amassing this massive wealth, and maybe you can get into some of the details of how we might think of how massive their wealth might be, then how did they start exerting influence with this money? And maybe we can start discussing their relationship between some of the actual noble houses and sovereign families.
Yeah, so the Fuggers make a conscious decision in the late 15th century to get into state finance. And the only reason that they did this, because these guys were pretty smart. They knew that if you wanted to be involved in state finance in the late Middle Ages, very beginning of the early modern period, there was a good chance you weren't going to get your money back, right? Like princes, kings, nobles were not good debtors to have. They routinely defaulted. They did not take particularly good care of their finances. They didn't really pay attention to it. They often did not have competent people to handle their finances. So whenever you do this, whenever you got involved in this business, there was a really good chance you were going to lose your shirt. The reason that the Fuggers got into it is because at the same time as they were considering making these loans to Maximilian, the emperor, big deal guy, there was an opening of the mining industry in the Habsburg lands, and they realized that, okay, we can make these loans because we have literal we have literal silver to serve as security on these loans. They didn't have to worry about Maximilian defaulting because they knew that there was an actual liquid product that was coming out that was just money. They were just getting money. The math worked out. It was really simple. It was really straightforward. And as they got deeper and deeper into bed with the Habsburgs, the amounts of money just got bigger and bigger. And then they turned that into copper mining. By the 1520s, by the end of Jakob Fugger's life, Jakob Fugger the Rich, they had effectively cornered 80% of the European copper market. Depending on the metric that you use, Jakob Fugger's assets comprised 2 to 4% of the entire GDP of Western and Central Europe at that point in time. So, I mean, just an immense amount of wealth. And so when they talk about Jakob Fugger being the richest man who ever lived, that's the metric that people are using.
And so they become inextricably linked with the Habsburg project in specifically in the East. Could you talk a little bit about where that would stand around the time of our story in the late 15th century, early 16th century, maybe specifically talking about one of the events that we talk about as a big precursor to the 30 Years' War, the Italian Wars. Yeah.
So the Fuggers, first Jakob, and then his nephew Anton, the only one of the family that Jakob trusted to continue the family business. He was not. These were not like pleasant guys, especially Jakob. They were not like nice people. They were very much like grind set.
Yes.
Dudes, like especially Jakob. And there's a great story that a guy who wrote a costume book, a guy who was an accountant, but he was also very into costumes and fashion. And he wrote this big illustrated costume book. He was like a fashion gay, I think, in the early 16th century.
He was a dandy fop.
Yeah, but he tells this story about how he had gone all over Western Europe to learn accounting practices, and he'd been to Venice, and I think he'd been to Florence too. And when he goes to try to work for Jakob Fugger, Fugger grills him so hard that the guy's like, I could have just stayed in Augsburg and learned from him. Like, I didn't have to go all over the place. Like, I could have just sat here and been like berated by Jakob Fugger and not had to travel at all. So they're not pleasant guys, but but basically they got deeper and deeper and deeper into the Habsburg business. The culmination of this is when Jakob Fugger essentially serves as the main creditor to Charles V when he buys the imperial crown upon his grandfather's death in 1519. Fugger provides the vast majority of the financing for that. It's an enormous expenditure. It runs into the hundreds of thousands. I mean, I think almost 1 million florins, which is just an absurd amount of money. The only reason that the Fuggers do this is because of New World silver, right? So they are the Fuggers realize that they've been using Maximilian's silver mines in the Tyrol, and they've been using the political connections from that to build up their copper business. The only thing that's going to serve as security for these other loans, these massive loans, are the silver resources that are now pouring into Spain. So basically, they are the court bankers to the Habsburgs, but that both undersells and oversells what they're doing. It oversells it to the extent that the Habsburgs had many court bankers because they were borrowing from literally anybody that would lend them money. But it undersells them to the extent that they are now inextricably linked to the entire financial edifice that is being built up in early modern Europe. So this is, again, the kind of underrated, overrated part of it. They're not the only ones who are doing it. They're just the biggest, and they've left us really good records, and we can kind of see what they were up to.
Nice.
You talk about how as soon as they got this banking fortune, they kind of wanted to get away from it because, that was not how a noble people of quality went about their lives. And by the 30 Years' War, Otto Fugger is actually a general in imperial service. I think that's, and how did he do? I don't
he was a pretty average dude. And I think this is the sign to me, when I saw you guys put Otto on the outline, and I was looking at him and thinking about him, like, what stands out at this point, and it shows just how much the Fuggers evolved, is how utterly fucking bog standard Otto Fugger is, where, like, there's nothing extraordinary about him at all. He's just your standard, like, not particularly gifted middling nobleman who, because of his family connections and family money and all the people that he knows, is just a general. And he just does that for a couple of decades, and he doesn't have any major successes. He doesn't have any major failures. He just kind of fucks along in the 30 Years' War as, like, one of these, like, rich dudes who raises soldiers. That's just that, like, that the fact that the Fuggers had gotten to the point where they could have a scion of the family be that kind of standard, unremarkable a nobleman with that kind of career path is really emblematic of how the family had risen by that part of the 17th century.
So then let's talk about their decline, because obviously, the Fugger name eventually leaves the heights of exceptional family wealth in our history. So what is the eventual fate of the Fuggers?
I mean, so part of it is that they are way too involved in both branches of Habsburg state finance. Yeah. And again, both branches of the family were just terrible people to have owe you money. The Philip II of Spain was absolutely the worst. He defaulted on his debts numerous times. The Fuggers, even by the 1570s, were having to write off enormous sums of money that Philip owed them. And this is part of what happens to Spain in the second half of the 17th century. Is it's just kind of exhausted in a whole bunch of different ways. It is exhausted financially in the sense that the Castilian wealth has been taxed so heavily to pay for all of these wars and to serve as kind of the security for all of these loans that generations of rulers have been taking out to fight these constant wars. They've completely tapped the New World silver supplies. Those funds are earmarked the second that they get off the boat. Right. That money has already been spent several times over.
We've mentioned in the main series that often the money just doesn't even touch Spain. It just goes directly to further European creditors.
Yeah, and the really amazing thing about that, and again, I think it's really emblematic of the period, is that was the case pretty much from the beginning. The first batch of Inca treasure that shows up had already been spent for Charles V's Tunis expedition in 1535. The Aztec treasure that came in, this first big batch, not like the constant shipments that are coming out of, brutal enslavement, mines, all that good stuff. The big windfalls of cash had already been spent the moment that it arrived. That was true in 1520, 1521, 1522. It was true in 1533, 1534, 1535. It's just extraordinary how good they were at spending money and how bad they were at paying it back. Like it was, if there was a Habsburg family trait, that was it. They were all really good at spending money.
Just the basic mechanisms that we should imagine these guys as banking lenders. So they're basically forwarding money for state projects for the Habsburgs with a small amount of interest, with the expectation that silver that the Habsburgs are raising is going to come back and pay the principal plus extra. Just what we should imagine about the basic principles of banking is how they are operating.
Yeah, basically. But so silver is best. Silver is the best security, but also there are increasingly sophisticated ways of getting paid back over the course of the 16th and into the 17th centuries. One of the reasons why the Fuggers were happy to lend the Spanish branch money, it was because the Spanish crown had actually been the first to develop kind of ongoing methods of debt repayment to kind of carry a floating state debt that's getting paid out of tax revenues in annuities to the people who hold these shares in the state debt. And so the Fuggers held a whole bunch of these shares of the state debt. The problem was they could also be what had been given by the crown could also be taken away. So, there's this really fascinating mixture of things where some of this is kind of virtual in the sense that we're used to understanding state debt and state finance as it's all kind of, you're pushing numbers around a paper. But at the end of the day, in the 16th century, there is still an expectation that there is a physical thing that you're going to get out of it. So it's one of the things that makes this period really interesting from a finance perspective is that you have an uneasy mixture of the pushing of numbers around ledgers, but at the same time, the need to, at some point, get paid back physical money for things. And when
get a chest of silver coins delivered to your house.
An actual chest of silver coins. And so much of it is so much of what drives this period is the fact that financiers and a very small number of smart state servants, and there's some overlap between those categories, were increasingly comfortable with the pushing of money around ledgers. And so it really speeds up the velocity of money. It's really part of what drives the transformation of the economy in Western Europe at this point in time, is like that people were just so much more comfortable doing that, which meant more transactions, which meant more theoretical money in circulation, which meant that you could do more stuff, and more stuff generally meaning in this period, just more war.
Well, let's get on to some of those new techniques. But before we move off the Fuggers, finally, I do kind of want to talk about, it's a bit of errata, but about how they were embedded in society itself. And I find it interesting that one of the first public housing projects in the Western world is explicitly a Fugger family project, the Fuggeri, a public housing project, I think dating back from the 16th century or early 17th century. So can you talk about kind of their... we talked about the relationship with these sovereigns. What's the relationship with the society around them? Yeah,
it's one of the things that I think is kind of hard for us to imagine about a family that's that rich, where there is not a good modern parallel for it, is just how much the Fuggers' activities were directed at their peers and neighbors in the city of Augsburg. So the Fuggeri is a really good example of this. It is a public housing project. You can still live there today. It's still running. It is still an ongoing, viable concern. I think you have to be Catholic to live there. I think that's still
Sure.
true. But yeah, it's still
a beautiful little cottage in Augsburg is worth a mass.
Yeah, I think absolutely true. But yeah, a lot of what they did was really directed at getting people to think well of them in the community. So it's still this kind of like late medieval urban burger mindset that the Fuggers never really outgrow. A lot of what they do is like trying to build prestige among this interlinked group of Augsburg merchant families. They're not doing display for all of the German speaking lands. They're not trying to become known broadly across Western Europe. It's that they're Augsburg people and they want to be known in Augsburg and they want to build things in Augsburg, and it's important to them to be thought of well in Augsburg. It's really surprisingly provincial considering the scope of their activities.
Well, you're walking down the street. You don't want somebody to chuck a cow pie at your head,
Exactly. But which is, again, one of the charming things about the late Middle Ages and the early modern period is that was still a thing that people did. Right? Like if they thought that you were being greedy or an asshole, like you could just toss dung at somebody as they were walking down the street. You might get in trouble for it.
Katzmusik. Cat music. This is the thing. If you were an asshole in the community, people would show up outside your house at the middle of the night, bang pots and pans, and throw rocks at your house and wail like cats.
Yeah, there are all of these mechanisms of social leveling that still exist again in this period. That makes it a kind of an interesting transitional time where like these medieval or ideas that were really prevalent in the Middle Ages about fairness and the distribution of wealth are not entirely gone yet, right? And so it's still really important for people like the Fuggers to justify themselves to their neighbors as being like virtuous and righteous in the way that they've come about their wealth and the way that they use their wealth.
Great. So now let's move on from the Fuggers. Although we must imagine all, their actions running in the background of everything that we're talking about here, or the foreground, depending on if we're overrating or underrating them. So you touched on how like the mechanisms and tools that we are developing during this time. So I'm wondering if we could talk about some of those actual innovations and then through them how finance is actually concentrating during this period. So, we kind of tossed off that we find double entry bookkeeping to be something so simple that it's kind of remarkable that it took this long to develop. But maybe you could go into, kind of what people are coming to be accustomed to in terms of things like double entry bookkeeping, bills of credit and exchange, stuff like that.
Yes. Yeah. So what we see in this period is not necessarily the development of entirely new instruments, though the joint stock corporation is one of those. Insurance is another, but it's mostly that these things had already existed and they become more prevalent and widespread across Western Europe, where before they had really been concentrated in the big commercial cities in Italy and to a lesser extent in southern Germany. By the end of the 16th century, they're just everywhere. Right. So these what are considered good accounting practices, double entry bookkeeping being the prime example of that, that's just everywhere. Instead of it being something that you've got to go to Venice to learn, like Jakob Fugger went to Venice to learn double entry bookkeeping, and to learn how to like all of these advanced techniques for how to run a business. You don't have to go to Venice for that anymore. By the end of the 16th century, you can learn that in a market town in pretty much anywhere in Western Europe. These sophisticated ways of doing things are just omnipresent. They have become the norm. Interesting side note, though, you can run a pretty complex business without double entry bookkeeping, and there are some really big commercial concerns well into the 16th century where their bookkeeping is what we would consider to be kind of a mess. But it worked for them. The accounting methods that they used, they would use something more like kind of a running tally of money coming in and money going out. And that worked for them. It worked for them up to a point. And the shift to a double entry system, it has as much to do with a kind of a rationalization of financial activity and attitudes toward it as it does the actual effectiveness of the technique. So it becomes that this is how we do business. This is how an organized, rational person does business, not just that it's objectively better.
Is there a part of that is standardizing across the continent? So it's like once these practices become more widespread, it's then, your business in Milan can communicate with a Flemish business in a way that is comprehensible to both?
Yeah, it works for everybody. It becomes kind of a European standard, and it helps
to your point about kind of the mechanisms and the actual tools of finance, it helps when everybody is keeping their books the same way, because it facilitates transfers and business between them. So a lot of what you end up seeing, and again, this was a tool that had existed in the Middle Ages, is just book transfers, right? So where no actual amount of money ever changes hands. It's a purely notional transfer from one account to another. If you both have funds in a bank, or you have both deposited money with the Fuggers in Antwerp, right? Like no actual money ever needs to change hands. Nobody ever needs to see silver or gold coin or bullion or anything physical at all. It's just you move money from one account to the other within the book. Double entry bookkeeping makes that a lot easier to do at scale.
And I assume that all going on with this whole process is, in addition to just building the technologies of bookkeeping and debt management and stuff like that, you're also kind of building a social understanding that these are things that can be done, and that there is a level of social trust, at least among the people in this class, that needs to kind of change in the mindset to make this kind of high-level financial work possible.
Yeah, to some extent, that's already there. When you look at the way that even medieval peasants handled things among themselves, there was often not a lot of actual coin going around. So they end up with these pretty sophisticated understandings of credit. And everybody kind of owes everybody money, and that's okay. It all works out. But there's definitely a rationalization of it. There's definitely all of these things are made more explicit. So instead of it being kind of a customary understanding of you owe me money, I owe this person money, so you guys can just owe each other money and our debt is wiped clean, that kind of thing, the kind of basic understanding of this kind of basic running tally of social debt that you see even in small communities, it becomes more rationalized, it becomes more written down, it's more likely to make its way into an actual account book instead of it just being something that, we all know who owes everybody money. So the attitude is there, but we see a much more explicit kind of infrastructure getting built up for it.
And that increases the coercive power of debt to actually have social control rather than it being, a organic element of like a flow between people. It facilitates the importation of a hierarchy and the imposition of hierarchy.
Yes, that's absolutely the case. And it's one of the ways in which you can see hierarchies becoming firmer in this period is whose debts count, who has to pay their debts. Well, poor people have to pay their debts, or they get in trouble. Rich people can often just write off their debts, and there's often not even an expectation that the debt will be paid back. If you're that being able to default on your debt and have that be okay is a sign of your social status, right? Like kings don't always pay their debts back, and of course there are consequences for that. But and nobles can often write off their debts. It's part of what a noble is supposed to do. Is you take some bad loans. Like that's part of that's part of the job description, right? Even for the people for whom indebtedness and bankruptcy was really bad are if it causes a commercial failure of your business, that is a concomitant loss of your social status for a big merchant company. Right. And that's going to bring you a little disgrace. But even then, it doesn't last that long. You can still get your kids jobs with the other big merchant houses because maybe your individual social capital is gone, but that's not necessarily true of the entire family. Send your kids out with an uncle who hasn't gone bankrupt and you're fine. And the same names will pop up 2 generations down the road. The family's still there. It's all right.
Matt, you made sure when we were planning this out that I wrote down insurance. You want to ask a question about the development of that? Yeah.
So this is an actual innovation of the era, and it's incredibly important for facilitating risky ventures, which is key to this whole thing. How do we see insurance develop as a tool for finance at this period?
Okay, so again, insurance is something that it is a new innovation, but it has existed before. So there's some evidence for insurance in the Roman period. There's a little bit of evidence for it there. It shows up at a few places in the Middle Ages, especially in the big Italian trading cities. There's some insurance in Venice, for example. But it really becomes a big deal in this period, and it becomes a big deal because the scale is so much bigger, right? These ventures are so much bigger, and the markets for insurance become much tighter.
That's one of the big developments. Is it's not just that insurance becomes more widespread. It's that the people who are writing these policies are taking much tighter margins on them and are doing much more kind of intensive calculations to see what the risk is. And so when we talk about insurance, a lot of it has to do with kind of the attitudes and the precision of the techniques. So even if it's a thing that's existed before and you can see precedents for it, it just becomes so much of a bigger deal that it allows. Again, I think exactly what you said, Matt. It allows for these risky ventures to be capitalized. There's a greater assurance that if you put your money into it, you're not going to entirely lose your shirt. You're going to lose something. You might lose your life, but
then what do you care afterwards?
Yeah. Then it's your family's problem to deal with.
Well, you mentioned how like a lot of these things, you see its first emergence in the northern Italian city-states. That's where like the real first modern precursors of capital markets are built. But then over the centuries, we see this migration of capital sort of up the Rhine and then into the Low Countries and finally into England. Why exactly does this occur, and what is different? What develops along this progress, basically, as you go from the northern Italy to the German cities of the Rhine to the Low Countries in England?
So in outline, that's exactly what happens, right? But I think it's important to see it as a kind of a as a more of a back and forth process. Mm-hmm. That there's constant movement between these places, even as the general migration is happening, right? Even as the weight of financial gravity is moving from Italy to southern Germany, then up the Rhine into the Low Countries and across England, that there's still like these big and increasingly dense networks of contacts that connect all of these places. So you have a lot of Germans who are in Italy and they're picking up the techniques and they're building commercial connections and they're investing money in northern Italian city-states. Like the arms business is a great example of this in the late Middle Ages and early modern and in the 16th century, where it's basically Augsburg and Milan, right? And so you have shipments of ore and shipments of weapons that are moving back and forth between the two places. But so is the money to pay for them. Right. So there's a physical transfer of goods and knowledge and people going back and forth between these places that drives the process. When the Low Countries become the center of financial gravity, a lot of that is because there are physically South German merchant houses that are resident in Antwerp. Mm-hmm. Right. So there's a physical movement of people that goes along with this. It's part of the international world of finances. There are Italians in Antwerp and there are Flemings in Venice and there are South Germans in both places. And eventually that becomes true in Amsterdam as well. So there's a lot of these banking families and merchant families are tied together. They're married into one another. So even if they are resident in Antwerp, they've got a branch of the family in Augsburg. There's a branch of the family in Hamburg. There's a branch of the family in London. And individuals can go between these different branches of the families. And so there's a constant transfer of money, of knowledge, of people between these various financial centers, even as the center of financial gravity is shifting. As far as what drives it, in the case of Antwerp, it's pretty clear. It's because the Portuguese crown starts selling all its spices through there. So instead of having to sell all its spices through Lisbon and having to bring everybody there, eventually they just ship it all to Antwerp. And at least for a little, they eventually move it back. But for a while, Antwerp just becomes the place where, well, the South Germans are going to go there because they want to distribute spices. The Italians are going to go there because they want to distribute spices. And if everybody's physically there, then you might as well be trading. You might as well be doing the money market as well.
And, just to be very specific on that, would you say that kind of internationalization of finance through these networks of financialized families is a specific innovation of this 200-year time period or something that becomes exponential during
it becomes exponential. There's just so much more money flowing through these networks that even if the networks had existed before, because you can it's one of the things that makes, for example, Florence stand out in the Middle Ages is just that there were so many frickin' Florentines and they were just everywhere, right? So you could always find somebody that you knew to do business with. You could, like, somebody had a cousin in Genoa, somebody had a cousin in Seville, somebody had a cousin in London. My brother's in Augsburg, right? Like, there's always just somebody to do business with. That becomes the case for everybody. In the early modern period, you can be, a merchant family from Lubeck, and you've got a brother-in-law in Calais who's working in the wool trade, and you're from Augsburg, but you've got but cousin Johann is working in the German steel yard in London, right? So it just becomes dramatically denser. And we can much more easily see these connections between places because of the dramatic expansion of how much text we have and how much evidence we have. So it's possible that there were denser networks than we realize in the Middle Ages, and we just can't see them for lack of evidence. But I really think it is a reflection of a genuine shift in the amount of internationalization.
So then let's move on to one of the main things that people were spending their money on at this time, which is war. Certainly, kind of the gooey center of what we're discussing within this city, the 30 Years' War, but also, or the series, the 30 Years' War. But, this is a time of intermittent and continuous warfare throughout the entire period. So, maybe you could talk a bit about like the actual mechanisms of funding wars, how people were trying to get returns at this time, and how kind of military and economic innovations were mutually reinforcing each other throughout this period.
Yeah. So there are two kind of basic principles that we have to start with to understand it. And the first of all is that war is a business. And war is a business for the entirety of this period. It is full of people who are actively trying to make a profit from the various aspects of warfare, right? So that's number one. Number two is kind of an anecdote, but I think it's pretty revealing. It's that the major financial centers of this period were also the major centers of arms manufacturing. So Augsburg, Venice, and eventually Amsterdam were all the biggest centers of arms manufacture and distribution, along with being biggest financial centers. So that's a really clear. And when you look down the list at the secondary centers of arms manufacture and distribution, they are also major financial centers: Nuremberg, Hamburg, Genoa. Oh yeah, Genoa is the biggest one. Genoa is the easiest example because that's where, if you want a galley in the Mediterranean in 1570, and you want to fund the construction of a galley, you go to Genoa. It's just these are enormous industries in terms of their scale. I mean, it's an easy parallel with the 21st century, right? You think about the scale of, the defense industry as a thing and the amount of money that goes into it. That is absolutely true in the early modern period as well. So at the highest level, all of this stuff costs money. You need 1,000 muskets. 1,000 muskets cost a lot of money. You need to have somebody who's going to at a basic level, fund that. Right? Like, because everybody's got to get paid before the muskets get delivered, right? So there have to be these kind of mechanisms of quotidian day-to-day finance and credit to go along with the arms industry. It's the same thing that exists in book publishing, for that matter. It's the exact same thing where you need to pay for materials up front. You need to pay the workers. You need to do all of this stuff. And so you have these little cycles of credit that are much more easily met in a place where in a big financial center, in a place where there's a lot of money already going around. So there's a merchant who can make the loan to the factory owner, who can advance the money to the laborers. So there's these little, think about these little like interlocking spirals of credit in all of these places. So that's what we see in finance and arms, but the same little spirals of credit are also what drive the actual industry of military recruitment and financing. So in the 30 Years' War, that's when this system kind of reaches its culmination. It is an almost entirely privatized system of providing military manpower, equipping them, and then paying them as campaigns go on. So there are varying levels of state control of the process, But even in the cases where you have what we think of as a royal army, the mechanisms by which the forces are actually raised are still entirely privatized. And where are the soldiers drawn from? They're drawn from an international market in military manpower, a mercenary market. So even the Swedes, who, are we think of as having kind of the most national army in this period, first of all, that was because Sweden was poor as hell. And so you could actually convince Swedes to go into the army to be paid a lower wage than was the norm in the international mercenary market. You could conscript them, pay them that wage, and they wouldn't immediately rebel. But as the Swedes go on, as the Swedes actually are landing, as Gustavus Adolphus is trying to campaign in Germany, he turns to the international mercenary market too. There are almost no Swedes in the Swedish army at Leutzen or Breitenfeld or any of these battles. I think there are maybe 1,500 Swedes in the Swedish army at Leutzen. So that is the basic thing, is you have this same pool of people. They are, a lot of them are drawn from kind of the fringes of Europe. So Uskoks in the Balkans, or what's now Croatia, Slovenia, that region. Scots are incredibly common up until 1642, when they all go home to fight in the English Civil War. So you have just this massive pool of manpower. By the end of the 30 Years' War, a lot of them are effectively military professionals. They've been doing this for decades. The general rule was that when you were raising a new unit, you needed about 1 in 5 troops to be experienced to give the unit kind of a backbone. But
cohesion,
that would give it an identity. But the actual mechanism of this is you have a main contractor who's being hired by the kind of contracting state, right? So the Elector Palatine or the King of France or whoever, they get the contract. They are going to have to front money to their colonels. Their colonels are going to, who are the ones who are recruiting the individual units, are going to have to front money for recruitment. So again, it's these interlocking cycles of credit where everybody owes everybody money. And that's how these things work. So you can see how it so easily gets tied in with these financial centers and with this kind of growing industry of finance, is that they're the exact same mechanisms. They're drawing on the exact same resources. The same people who are being involved in arms manufacturing are also maybe you own a factory, but you also will raise a unit. We also raise a unit of cavalry for this campaign. The really kind of stunning thing is just how pervasively commercial the mindset of warfare is. That you'll often see in the scholarship these colonels referred to as shareholder colonels, because they are shareholders in the general military enterprise. They you have these big figures like Wallenstein and Tilly and even Gustavus Adolphus you think of as they're running the army. No, they are effectively the CEO with a very fractious board that they report to below them, who have all invested an enormous amount of their own time and money in this enterprise, and they are expecting to turn a profit from it.
So one of the things that emerges from this period, the 30 Years' War, its adjunct, the 80 Years' War in the Low Countries, is the explosion, supernova explosion of the Dutch, of the United Provinces, as the center for global capital. And how exactly does this happen? Where this province, really, of the greater Spanish Habsburg domain is able to harness all of these trends and technologies and ways of being into a massive force multiplier.
So, and the really stunning thing is that wasn't even the rich part of the Netherlands.
Yeah.
The part that eventually becomes like Amsterdam, the center of global finance for quite some time, that wasn't even the part that people wanted. The part that people wanted was Antwerp and Bruges. Bruges in the Middle Ages was the financial center of Northern Europe. That shifts to Antwerp in the 16th century. One of the reasons why it shifts to Amsterdam is because, especially after the sack of Antwerp, the really brutal sack of Antwerp by Spanish soldiers in the 80 Years' War, soldiers who hadn't been paid, by the way, really, again, a common theme in this period, people physically left Antwerp and went to Amsterdam. So they took their money, they took their knowledge, their kind of institutional know-how of how finance is supposed to work, and they just physically moved to Amsterdam. So that's part of it. But the biggest piece is, I think so first of all, there's a good agricultural base. We don't really think of the Low Countries as being like being super fertile, but the countryside was incredibly productive by early modern standards. And the soil was rich enough and the farmers were rich enough that they could have exceptionally high levels of labor input into the land that they had. So, they could put in big capital investments in dikes, windmills, things like this. Like what we think of as kind of being the stereotypical aspects of the Dutch countryside. Those were actually capital investments to make the land more profitable. So there's an agricultural base close to home that can feed a substantial proportion of the people. That allows for high levels of urbanization. So the Low Countries in general are already the most urbanized part of Europe. It's the Low Countries and Northern Europe, and Northern Italy are the two, and the Low Countries start to outstrip Northern Italy by the 16th century. So you have a concentration of people. You have a concentration of money. This is a hub of merchant activity. It has been for a long time. All of the leading European banking houses and merchant families have branches there. It's close to the centers of wool production in England, so you've got a bit of an industrial base. You have enough of all of these things, plus a long tradition of seafaring, that when you get into the late 16th century and you have incredibly high capital demands for these high risk but high profit ventures like spice trading, the pieces are in place to allow you to do that. So the Dutch, what stands out about the Dutch East India Company in relation to previous ventures is that they went for the whole thing from the beginning, right? Like they were not kind of like sneaking in one ship at a time. They decided they were going to go out and they were going to literally corner the market on spices. And so, I mean, the sheer balls of that venture, first of all, like the amount of kind of strategic vision that it takes to think that that's what you're going to do, and knowing the kind of capital requirements necessary to do that, they were able to raise the money. And then it becomes a kind of a self-sustaining thing, right? That as the money starts to roll in from these ventures, I mean, and not all of the Dutch ventures were successful, right? Like there are plenty of joint stock ventures that go belly up, but there's enough capital. There are enough people who are willing to invest. So not just big investors, there is a level of comfort with financialization and investment and kind of how these mechanisms going down through Dutch society that mobilizes a massive amount of capital. It makes a massive amount of capital available. It's a prosperous society, not just among the elite, but down into kind of the middling people and even these farmers out in the countryside, right? Like they have capital. And it is a normal thing to invest your capital in these ventures. This was also true of Venice in the Middle Ages, right? Like you could take your money if you were, let's say, a shipwright in Venice in 1450 and say, you know what, I think this voyage is a good idea. I'm going to put my money into that and maybe I'll get a little return on it. That was a normal thing to do there. It was a normal thing in the Netherlands, and the mechanisms through which you could pool that capital became much more sophisticated. The Joint Stock Corporation it's brilliant in that regard.
Yes. So one of the unique things then is the kind of breadth and depth of the social embeddedness of these new capital formations. Can you maybe just like go in a little bit on what is unique about the Dutch East India Company and its mechanisms of creating investment strategies, and then maybe from there we can go into a little bit about like more 17th century, like how mercantilism as we understand it and monopolism in these companies works.
Yeah, one of the things that really stands out about this is the permanence of them, right? So as opposed to previous ventures in which people were investing, say in Venice, like the Venice example I just used, that was a one-off voyage, right? And you may have an ongoing relationship with a captain or with a kind of a sponsoring merchant family, but that was a one-off thing. You put in your money, you get your money out. The Dutch East India Company becomes a permanent institution, and it becomes a permanent institution with a great deal of institutional knowledge that was directly tied into the Dutch state, right? There's no easy distinction between the Dutch state and the Dutch East India Company because it's the same people. and they're all related. They all know each other. The state officials have their money in the East India Company, and the East India Company is the profits of the East India Company are rolling into the Dutch state. And so there's no easy distinction between those two things. So again, you have a social embeddedness of the ideas that make it possible to pool capital in the first place, and then the political embeddedness of these big companies themselves. They become inseparable from the state itself in any meaningful way.
Here's where I want to go with that is, as we get into the later part of the 17th century, we take this series up to like 1688. You see, because of the embeddedness of these institutions, especially in the Netherlands or the United Provinces, and then increasingly up into England, this very interrelated working of these massive, persistent companies and the state. So can we talk a bit about this, idea of protectionism and monopolism as the guiding state economic principle that then allows these companies to function in the way that they do in the 17th century? That is different from the way that we understand, markets now, but it is the thing that like sets up the markets to function in perpetuity.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a way of economic thinking in this period that is very zero sum, right? That if we don't get it, then somebody else will. If we get it, somebody else can't get it. So you have that kind of thing there at a basic level, but there's also kind of the sense of like, who is the state for? And this is one of the big developments in this period, and this is true. This is true first in the Netherlands, and then it's true in England as well. Is that it's the back and forth between these groups of people, like who is the state for, who is the state working for, and in the Middle Ages, there's a sense that like usually the state is for the nobility, it's for the king, it's a God granted thing, whatever. Maybe you've got the House of Commons, but again, these are like landowning gentry. That's who the state is for. That's who is extracting value from the state. That's who is controlling the mechanisms of state in the localities. When you have a state that is built around the interests of merchants, then you're going to get something a little bit different. And this is what you see in the Italian city-states, right? This is why they seem so mercantile as things, is because, again, the merchant families are running the state, and the state is running the state is involved in the workings of the merchant families. This becomes true, but at a massively increased scale as the 17th century goes on. So the amounts of money that are involved, it become increasingly staggering. And the reason, and I think this is especially true in naval warfare, where again, you just have, it takes a massive capital investment to build a large warship. That is just the timber, the technical know-how, paying the workers to build it, casting the cannon, getting everybody on board, crewing a ship with skilled sailors. Like this is that's just an enormous amount of money involved in that. And to put a whole fleet of those out is even more staggering. So it's not a coincidence that you see those fleets in the places that have the greatest concentration of financial capital and the greatest overlap between the state and these merchant houses, right? There are these ongoing merchant concerns or commercial concerns, because the two things just are inextricably linked. That the best way to support the state is for the companies to make money. The best way for the state to support the companies is to build the fleets that make it possible to carry out a policy of enforcing a monopoly. All right. So they're mutually reinforcing strands where the idea of what the state is and what the state is supposed to do goes along with the resources that the companies provide. So it becomes this kind of feedback loop.
So I want to take that all the way to the very end of what our series is. But first, I feel like there's one last eddy of what's going on in Europe around this time that we should touch on. Matt, do you want to talk about like the inflation crisis and the financial crisis going on throughout here or throughout this period?
See, this is the period when all this species is causing prices to just rise for everything everywhere, and that has different effects for different levels of society. But what is the general impact of this century-long inflation in Europe?
Lowered quality of life for huge numbers of people. Living standards fall for vast numbers of people across Europe in this period. Living standards fall in Castile. Castile is Castile is kind of the bellwether for this, where you can see that's where the inflation starts to hit first. That's where you see this kind of demographic exhaustion, where after the better part of 2 centuries of population growth, population starts to level off or even decline. Part of that is outmigration to the New World, but part of it is just like decline in fertility. Life is hard. You're being taxed hard to pay for all this shit. And life is difficult. You throw in a little bit of a climatic shift, your crop yields go down, and an influx of actual species, then prices are going to rise. Your money doesn't go as far. You buy less. Life is worse for a lot of common people in the 17th century, even as there is a shift toward a consumer, and this is tied into a shift toward a consumer society where instead of, everybody kind of making their own stuff or it being distributed at a village level, you have, centers of production and you're shipping shoes out and, kind of the growth of a consumer society that's often dated to this period. You end up with this like general drop in quality of life and general drop in standards of living for huge numbers of people. And it happens to differing degrees in different places. It doesn't happen in the Netherlands. It doesn't happen in London. It doesn't happen in some of the big cities in northern Italy that are still pretty prosperous. But especially in the countryside, it's tough times. It's tough times for a lot of people. Taxes are rising. The state is increasingly involved in your life. Your money isn't going as far, and also the weather is worse. So,
all right. So then to bring it all home, we basically are making the argument throughout the course of this series that throughout this crisis, what we are kind of seeing is the birth of the very infant forms of what we can call capitalism. And I just would like to get your opinion on when do you think this all can get wrapped together to be referred to as something we might understand as the earliest forms of capitalism. And I also think that part of this is maybe the development of, in addition to this merchant class, the very first things of what we could, the very first instances of what we might see as like a laboring class or a working class that goes along with it. So just want to get your take on that.
Yeah, I think the 30 Years' War in a lot of ways is kind of the last gasp of a lot of these systems of a prior age, right? So let's use a concrete example. Let's use soldiers as an example of this, right? So one of the reasons why war is so endemic is because there are so many people who think war is their job among the nobility, and they're perfectly happy to invest their money as a commercial venture in doing war, right? Soldiering itself was not like a super low status occupation for people. It becomes an increasingly professionalized occupation over the course of this period for larger and larger numbers of people. So by the end of the 30 Years' War, you have smaller armies than you did at the outset, but they are increasingly comprised of people whose job is to be a soldier, and they've been doing this for years, and this is who they are, and this is their thing. But it's not bad. Their pay is not. They may not always get paid, but notionally their pay is relatively high compared to laborers. In the aftermath of the 30 Years' War, that changes. Soldiering becomes an increasingly low status occupation till by the time you get to the middle of the 18th century, and these kind of long service professional armies in France and in the German states and Spain and England, being a soldier is just one of the worst occupations you can have. Your pay is terrible. You're subject to increasingly harsh discipline and constant oversight. Like when you read drill manuals from the middle of the 18th century, every single motion that you have is controlled, is visible and controlled, right?
Yeah, we are entering the era of rum sodomy and the lash.
Yes, that's exactly it. And you see that among sailors too, where, being it's one of the reasons why you get a lot of piracy at the end of the 17th and 18th century is the kind of the clash between the ethos of being like a skilled professional worker and being subject to increasing amounts of discipline while you're doing your job, right? And so a lot of people are just, I'm going to be a pirate instead.
But we'll just be a freelance Navy.
Yeah, that's kind of what happens
after our own officers.
After the War of Spanish Succession, that's kind of exactly what happens. Every time people would get out of the Navy and they'd be like, well, like sailing, like making money, don't like being whipped.
Reasonable. Makes sense.
not an unreasonable set of assumptions to have. But it's really a microcosm of the whole shift that you're seeing among workers at this time, right? Is that it's increasing amounts of surveillance, increasingly low wages tied into inflation. Like wages are not going up as fast as prices for everything are going up. And so it's an increasingly kind of hierarchical way of controlling labor. And military labor is labor. Naval labor is labor. You can see the exact same things happening there that you see in kind of nascent systems of nascent industrial formations, in terms of like, instead of having a putting out system, you're gathering all the labor together in one place so that you can surveil it, right? Yeah, so the same developments that are happening in armies and in navies are happening among craft workers, right? Like guilds are always a tool for the guild masters to extract concessions and set prices, but they increasingly have no place at all for lower level workers, right? So there's an increasing distinction between the noble officer class in an army, who still think of themselves as proprietors, right? And the people who are actually doing the work. That's in the 30 Years' War. There's still these aspects of these older traditions, right, where these kind of corporate traditions of soldiering. So like the Landsknechts in the early 16th century are a good example of this. Like, they are notoriously democratic. The Swiss, notoriously democratic. Like, the Swiss would sometimes just like decide before a battle, we're not going to fight. We want to get paid more, so we're going on strike until you double our wages. And you don't see that as much in the 30 Years' War, but there are still aspects where, like, being a soldier is, it's an honorable profession. It's still got a tinge of the knightly to it. Like, there's honor to be found there, and your pay isn't terrible. Like, after the 30 Years' War, and as armies get bigger and they're more and more under the control of the state, and they're increasingly surveilled, and nobles get like nobler about their shit, it's indicative of the shift that's happening all across these economies.
All right, I just have one further question that I think could elucidate a lot from throughout this series for a lot of numbers we throw out. Patrick, what's the value of a thaler?
Oh my God. I should have looked this up.
I know this is kind of a trick question, but basically we throw around a lot of figures of like who owes what, $400,000 or 300,000 gulden
we
here.
Kind of we just like give people like it's what they use. Just
it's a lot of money, but
it's a decent amount. It's the transactional amount of money.
If you could think of 400,000 of anything, it's going to be a lot. But I don't know. I guess it's just like how should we be thinking about the value of a thaler?
How many dollars does it take to buy a PS5?
Okay, so that's actually the difficult thing about comparing amounts of money over time is the purchasing power for different things. Like, different things are more or less expensive in different eras, right? Like, in some eras, food is really expensive and clothing is cheap. In others, clothing is really expensive and food is cheap. Electronics are a great example of this today, right? Like, electronics used to be super fucking expensive, and now PS5 is half the price of what a shitty TV was 30 years ago. Like,
or TVs are honestly a great example of this, because you can get a really nice TV for like $150, $200 now,
Yeah. And the same is true even across decades, centuries, and different regions in the early modern period, where, so we throw the figures around, but like, what a thaler would buy you in one place is not necessarily what it would buy you somewhere else. So there are areas where food is really, really cheap. Like in Eastern Europe, food is exceptionally cheap. Food in Amsterdam is expensive because so much of it has to be imported from the Black Sea, or not from the Black Sea, from the Baltic, from the peasants who are being increasingly exploited in this period. So a thaler is not worth the same thing everywhere. As a general rule, I actually don't remember what the conversion is for a thaler. I remember it was like 1.4, 1.6 gulden to a florin.
Oh,
and
okay.
the florin and ducat standard was supposed to be the same. But that's for the 16th century. I'm not sure what it is in the 17th.
Yeah. So I mean, it's just it's $400,000 no matter where you go. That's going to be a lot. That's a lot of dollars.
Yeah. Just remember, whenever there's 100,000 attached to it, that's a lot of money in this period. Anytime you get above, I remember the one that was good was for Columbus. The amount of money that Columbus's expedition cost was like the annual income of a low level provincial aristocrat in Spain.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great. And I actually have one more question that I might shift back earlier to the Dutch. I have no idea if you have any background on this, but it was something that was interesting to me as we were trying to research this, which is one of the kind of oddities of the Dutch Golden Age that I was looking into, and I couldn't quite get a straight answer about. There seems to be some revisionism about this. Do you know much about the tulip mania?
Yeah.
Is that just an oddity, a rumor, a bunch of people hurling insults at each other, or was that genuinely a phenomenon with economic impact?
Okay, so this scholarly opinion has swung in both directions, where for a while it was treated as one of the first examples of a genuine bubble. So you would place it in this narrative of financial bubbles that goes along from that to like the South Sea, the South Sea Company is another one. Isaac Newton losing all his money on the South Sea Company. So you would put this in a narrative of a string of failures of capital of increasingly capitalist market driven kind of thing. So it's a bubble, right? In recent years, my understanding is that has shifted, that the tulip thing really got blown out of proportion. I still think that it is reflective of the same impulses, even if it's not a huge deal economically. I think that I think it's still a bubble, and it still tells us a lot about how people were understanding the value of things, even if it's not like a huge deal for the Dutch economy as a whole. Like I think that's kind of the middle ground on it, is that this is something that can only happen in an increasingly financialized economy where the value of the actual thing is becoming separate from the notional value is separate from any sort of real inherent value to the thing. But yeah, so I think it's interesting from that perspective. It doesn't crash the Dutch economy or anything like that. The Dutch end up being fine.
Yeah, as I was reading about it and looking into it, I thought that the real tell about it was that there were multiple pieces of satirical art from the time, kind of displaying tulip traders as monkeys or people on like a ship of fools being guided by the lying winds of fate. That to me said that at the time people were looking at this and being like, this is wild. This is wacky.
Yeah. Oh, I do love that we're now in the post NFT age, and we just have a perfect parallel for thinking about it.
Yes, exactly.
And for many of us who were there, like making fun of the Bored Ape Yacht Club from the very beginning, the tulip thing makes a lot of sense.
Yes, exactly. All right. Well, unless you have any other, final takeaways from what's going on in this period or anything else that you want to say, Patrick?
No, I mean, I think just kind of as a general thing, like the relationship between the military history often gets a bad rap for being like, nerds talking about, or like kind of weird nerds talking about battles and shit. But war and all of these very serious topics that we think of in terms of the kind of the long-term financial development of Western Europe and the origins of capitalism and these relationships between workers and between workers and hierarchy. All of this stuff is just made manifestly clear when you look at war as kind of this all-pervasive phenomenon in the 16th and 17th centuries. It just becomes a really clear way of understanding these broader developments that are happening in society and being the mechanism through which those developments happen.
Well, that is a perfect handshake, because next week we will be coming back at you with the War Nerd to talk about developments in war, the nature of war, how it was fought, and getting hopefully really into the actual nerdery of battles, technology, arquebuses, halberds, pikes, bastion,
all of which,
crenellated bastions, stuff
all
like
of which
that.
does fucking rule, just so we're clear.
Of course. Yes.
Who amongst us does not enjoy a tres Italian?
Yes.
Oh, huge
So,
fan.
Patrick, this has been great. Thank you so much for stopping by. Tides of History, wonderful show. We love it. And, of course, go check out The Verge, which, as I said up top, covers a little before the period we're focusing on here, but it is all the background that is necessary to get into the period that we're talking about. So thank you so much, Patrick, for joining us.
It is an absolute pleasure chatting with you, and thank you so much. I love that you guys are doing this. This is such a cool period and an underexplored period, too.
Awesome.
Well, thank you.
Welcome to Hell on Earth, Appendix 4, War. I'm Chris Wade.
I'm Matt Christman.
Though we've covered a lot of material on this series, its central focus has been war, the 30 Years' War, obviously. But the era we've looked at is a time of dynamic change and really the end of a lot of practices and the beginnings of some new ones. So today on the show, we'd like to take a deep dive into the nature of warfare in the 16th and 17th centuries, how wars were fought, who the warriors were, and by what new and terrible means they achieved their goals. And to help us, we are joined by none other than the war nerd himself. It's John Dolan. John, welcome to Hell on Earth.
Oh, yeah, I've been there. Nice place. Yeah.
So to start, let's go back to the previous age of warfare. By the time we get to 1618, we're looking at mercenary armies, combined arms, and siege tactics. But what did European war look like before that? John, if you could give us a brief overview of what armed conflict looked like in the late Middle Ages.
Yeah, well, I thought I'd sort of describe the different phases within medieval warfare because the Middle Ages are a long and murky era in I think most people's minds and in historians' minds. The Middle Ages are traditionally supposed to end with the fall of Constantinople in 1453 and begin with the coronation of Charlemagne in 800. But I mean, assuming we're talking about Europe, which in terms of the 30 Years' War, we probably are. So I think there's three phases in there. There's 800 to roughly 1,000, and then 1,000 to 1,300, more or less, and then 1,300 through the fall of Constantinople, or 1,300 to 1,500. So the first phase is when European warfare is a matter of much smaller armies, first of all, than in the ancient world. Some of the armies we on Radio War Nerd have been talking about naval battles in the Punic Wars, and there's a battle there that involved 300,000 fighters. That you don't see that around Europe in the first millennium, around 1000 AD. I thought I'd just describe one important battle, especially because it involves some terrain that will come up again in the 30 Years' War. And that's the Battle of Lechfeld in 955 AD. This was a very important battle between the Magyars, the Hungarians, when they were still mounted archers, descendants of steppe fighters, and the Holy Roman Empire under Otto, basically a quasi-united Germany. The Magyars had been raiding nonstop, all the way into Muslim Spain from Pannonia, from the plains of Hungary. And nobody knew how to stop them. Basically, European armies didn't know how to stop mounted steppe archers using compound bows and agile little ponies. until 955, where combination of Otto's organizational skills and some luck and some mistakes ended the threat from steppe archers pretty much once and for all. And what happened was they decided to attack in an area which was hemmed in by two rivers and flanked by a forest, and that meant they couldn't maneuver very well. And when they had to fight the mounted German knights, more or less, they couldn't hold up because they were not equally armored. It was raining. One good thing, if you ever have to fight a steppe army, try to fight them in the rain because the bowstrings get all messed up. And basically, there was a melee. Most cavalry fights involved melees, but it was not an equal melee because one side was heavily armored and used to just smashing people on the top of the head, and the other side did better when they could move, and the Hungarians couldn't move. So the German knights killed most of them. I mean, they even hanged some of the leaders, which to an aristocratic steppe society like the Hungarians, the Magyars, was shocking and horrific. Thieves got hanged. Leaders of whole clans don't get hanged. And they sent a few of the survivors back with minus their noses and their ears, which was, in the old saying, a way of talking without saying anything. And after that was the last raid into Western Europe or Central Europe by the Magyars. That was really the end of an era. Before that, a lot of effort in European armies was involved in building defensive fortifications where everybody could run in and hopefully lock the door, although that didn't usually work. Whether they were whether it was the fear of the Norse, the Turks, the Croats, the Moors, a rough category, whatever was the local horse riding terror. And after that, it became possible to go on the offensive, and Europe started considering ways of going on the offensive. And that leads into the High Middle Ages, as they're often called, 1000 to 1300. This was a relatively good time. There was actual global warming in a world that kind of appreciated it. I mean, if you're
the medieval high period, isn't that?
Yeah.
Is that called? Yes.
Yeah, if you're a medieval peasant with like one piece of clothing, global warming doesn't seem like such a bad thing, and you can grow your crops, and maybe they'll survive. And this is also a phase where there aren't a lot of radical changes in military technology. The longbow hasn't come into its own, let alone firearms. So basically, warfare has become kind of familiar. Warfare is mostly done on a feudal level, which involves a sort of fractal loyalty. That is, the king calls up his barons, those barons call up their barons, and then those little barons call up the freemen who can afford to equip themselves with a horse, and then those guys call up anybody who's not going to be a useless mouth to feed on the march, anybody who can swing an edged weapon of any kind. So warfare generally becomes somewhat more familiar, somewhat less terrifying for most of Europe. There are exceptions everywhere. But then around 1300 to 1500, you start getting new weapons, especially in the 100 Years' War, which begins in 1337. You get the longbow, first used in the wars between the English and the Welsh. The Welsh killed an awful lot of English knights, but they didn't quite have the numbers to defeat the English. And the English said, this works. This works against heavy cavalry. And that's when you get those famous battles leading to Kenneth Branagh doing hammy speeches about Agincourt, this band of brothers, blah, blah, blah. And there's a lot. That was a really interesting weapon. Like, reenactors have done some good work with longbows, and apparently all that John Keegan's cliche about the arrow cloud is not true. Longbow archers fired at armored knights pretty much point blank direct fire. You wanted to punch through that armor, and you didn't, point the bow 45 degrees in the sky. You just tried to put it through their heads, and you had a good chance of succeeding.
So the power of the bow really came from its use even as a close-up weapon?
Yeah. It was
That's not how I think about it.
No, that's not how it's usually talked about. But an arrow in an arrow cloud is falling. It's actually falling. What makes it do that nice parabola is that it's falling. I mean, it has some force, but it has a lot more force if you fire it at a shallow angle and it punches through somebody's breastplate, or it punches through the horse's armor, which is really just as good and generally a lot easier. But then comes the really big change in warfare, which is the slow and uneven introduction of gunpowder weapons. I mean, they go all the way back to the 9th century in China, as far as anybody knows. But then around 1200, people start talking about what are roughly firecrackers, and people being the nasty little clever things they are, you get from firecrackers to putting a little lead pebble in there pretty soon.
So that's kind of the overall nature of arms and armament and war. And you mentioned briefly the how armies were formed, the marshaling of people, the kind of medieval phone tree of calling up subdivisions of barons. Could you talk maybe a little bit about like the character of the knight or as a leader of this time, especially in comparison to what we're going to see later as we move into a more professionalized military? Who were these like commander figures in this era before we move on to the next phase?
Yeah, well, the knight develops throughout this era. Like a knight seems to have started out as a mounted fighter, and there are mounted fighters who are not noble or not necessarily noble through the Middle Ages. That's the original term for man-at-arms, originally in French. But knight, because the knight is something like the apex predator in this kind of warfare, gets associated with nobility around 1100, as far as anybody can tell. And then that leads to a code of chivalry. But an aristocratic fighter has certain characteristics that you see in the Song of Roland, which is supposed to be a Carolingian story. So it's supposed to go back all the way to the 800s. And that doesn't depend on being on a horse. It depends on being absolutely unafraid. And, the codes that insist on acting unafraid generally create the people that they want to create. So that the Song of Roland is very typical of chivalrous songs in that the lesson, the moral of the story is don't be too goddamn brave and get everybody killed, which is actually the moral of a lot of stories. I mean, there's something sort of similar to that, even all the way back to the Iliad.
Yeah, I was just thinking that.
Yeah, don't get everybody killed because it takes a lot. I mean, food is hard to come by. Raising a warrior takes a really long time, and it's a terrible loss. But if you are raised on a code of never retreat, then, that's what happens to Roland. He refuses to blow his great horn to save the army because chivalry demands that. And when he cleaves some Saracen's head, and they weren't Saracens, they were Basques, but in the song they're supposedly Saracens, he has a really interesting insult, which shows how social rank gets involved with this kind of Bushido stuff. When somebody comes up to him to try to kill him as he's dying there, pierced with many wounds, he says, "Who are you, you nobody?" And then brings his great sword down on the guy's head. As well, in a Woodhouse story, it would be a complete outsider, and therefore you deserve to die. So, yeah, knight originally means a heavy cavalryman without any implication of nobility, but it comes to mean nobility to the point that the titles are still being issued, and at this point they don't involve much implication about how well you can swing a heavy sword, but they still have that implication rather ridiculously that, you are someone of quality. I think Sean Connery is a knight, in fact, is the ultimate in ridiculous.
Yes. Actors, a lot of knighted actors at this point, So then as we move on into the, 15th and 16th centuries, in our series, we kind of pinpointed this ongoing conflict of the Italian Wars, the kind of ongoing Habsburg-Valois conflict as a kind of transitionary point between this older form of late medieval warfare and what we would then recognize as a newer form of warfare by the time we get to the 30 Years' War, especially involving the total implementation of firearms, the development of the pike and shot formations, and then also, as I just alluded to earlier, the changes in mobilization techniques and the rise of the mercenary army. So could you maybe talk about that transitionary moment of the 16th century and how those things were developed around that time?
Yeah, a lot of this has to do with firearms, because firearms require a different kind of army, and that's a really slow development. The earliest European photo of a man with a gun, something identifiable as a gun, comes from 1326. And then there are treatises about how to use a gun. But in the beginning, they're not the first weapon that cast into doubt the alleged supremacy of heavy cavalry, which is more complicated than that. But they are the final nail, really, in that. For the transition stage, by the way, I just want to say, if people haven't seen an Italian movie called The Profession of Arms by Olmi, it's an amazing movie. It's about an episode in the Italian Wars, someone leading a small band of sort of guerrilla fighters against a German invasion into Italy. And throughout most of the Middle Ages, it's a cliche of medieval history that you avoid big battles. No one wants big battles. They're very expensive, and you're rolling the dice on your life and your family's life and the existence of your principality. So there's a lot of raiding, the chevauchée, and that becomes a somewhat different thing when you're using firearms. But firearms develop slowly as a feature of medieval warfare right through the 14th century. There's a lot of other stuff going on in the 14th century. It's generally remembered as a pretty grim time. I mean, there's the 1348 plague, which wipes out a gigantic chunk of the European population. I was talking to a Norwegian who said, yeah, basically the biggest event in Norwegian history was 1349, because that's when it got to Norway, the plague. And we were never the same after that. That's a long time not to be the same. But anyway, right. So while this is happening, the two kinds of weapons that can make heavy cavalry less effective, the longbow and the rudimentary firearms, are coming into use. There are wooden cannons being used in European war right around the middle of the 14th century. And then in the Battle of Crécy, also around the middle of the 14th century, there are strange-looking weapons like organ weapons. One of them looks like a rake, a garden rake, only the tines of the rake, each one is a barrel, and you can fire all the barrels. You're not looking for pinpoint accuracy, but if you fire them in the face of a cavalry charge against you, it's sort of like firing a claymore mine at them, and it's going to do some damage. So nobody quite knows in the beginning how to deal with those. The cannons in the beginning are just weird things, like often big wooden tubes banded with metal, and you put a big chipped globe of a stone in there, and then you fire it at curtain walls. And most castles and strong points have only curtain walls because that's all you really need before firearms. And that kind of changes the rules. The walls become lower and thicker, and you can't do sieges in the traditional way. So that's the two main forms of warfare markedly changed. You can't do simple cavalry raids anymore because you got to think about who's got a gun. And you can't do traditional siege or resisting siege because, you lay siege if you're the attacker, but you also resist siege. The defensive side of a siege is also important. But, once these guns come into play, they start developing really quickly. Because warfare, I guess that's something we need to say first. Warfare is a yearly or almost a perennial fact. Not in terms of giant wars like the 30 Years' War, but raids into the people over the hills territory, raids to teach your sons how to fight, raids with some other local lords to see what you can do to those stern heretics or pagans a few mountain ranges away. This means that there's constant practice. Everybody's trying out what's working, what isn't working. But then the big cannons start to appear in the later 14th century. The basilisk cannons appear. Some of these could fire a 900-kilogram projectile against a target. But then you also start to get the development of smaller hand cannons, and hand cannon is a term in the beginning, and then matchlocks with flash in the pan, which comes from matchlock, where you drop the burning fuse onto your matchlock and it fizzes, but it doesn't shoot the gun. That's where that comes from, and this is going to change everything. It doesn't mean that edged weapons are no longer useful, but edged weapons were best, starting with the phalanx when you had deep, solid formations. Firearms require a spread-out line, and that's going to lead to this famous innovations by Gustav Adolf of Sweden, the battalions, supposedly replacing the tercio, but not necessarily really. So the whole shape of formation in battle is going to change. And that's going to have some social changes with it, because if you've got a gun, pretty much everybody is equal with a gun. It doesn't take as long to learn as a longbow. I mean, that's one of the biggest things about longbows. Ben Franklin famously said, "Why don't we teach our troops to learn longbows instead of firing muskets?" And that was kind of the half-bright kind of thing that Ben Franklin was always saying, because, yeah, it's true. You can fire a longbow. If you've ever seen anybody doing the new reconstructions of how to use a longbow, they don't stand still and aim it into the air. They jump around and they shoot at targets, and it's scary. But the thing is, the reason the English could have a longbow force once they stole it from the Welsh is that they enforced training every Sunday on the village square. And if you weren't there, somebody was going to come after you, because you had to practice that longbow for hours every single week. It was your duty. With a gun, you just sort of have to point it in the general direction, because you couldn't really aim the thing. this is not a rifled musket. This is just a giant, scary pea shooter. And almost anybody could be trained to do that. And that has very big social changes, social effects too. Like, what does a knight mean when you can just pick up a musket and take a few days training and then learn how to fire it?
Or potentially, as a commander, Shanghai a bunch of peasants into it and get them ready to take on a knight within a week's training or something.
Yeah, and you know, that was not a feature of medieval warfare. One of the things about medieval warfare, they did not want a bunch of peasants following after them most of the time. You might want a bunch of peasants when you were trying to defend a castle or something, because it's not that hard to throw rocks down on people and throw spears down at people. But you had to feed them. And food was scarce, and you could not expect them to hold the line in battle, especially if they were going to be attacked by heavy cavalry. In fact, it was guaranteed that they would run. I mean, when you think of that famous Braveheart scene, it's like, you can fight or you can run. And years from now, you'll be thinking, I mean, at that point, the whole Scottish peasantry would have been over the next hill, you know, before Mel Gibson could stop them. We can run? Okay. Because it just didn't make sense to go up against people who could afford giant horses, really giant horses. They didn't even ride those horses. It was too uncomfortable. They rode saddle horses, palfreys, to the battle. Then they switched over to their tank horses. You didn't want to fight things like that, you know, and it didn't really make sense. But with an early gun, you kind of have a chance. So a lot of European industry goes to developing saltpeter, one of the big ingredients of gunpowder, which involved basically collecting a lot of shit and piss and letting the saltpeter leach out of that. You know, it's kind of in many ways, it's kind of an ugly industry, but it's very effective.
Isn't like a guano, like a big like bat guano, like a huge way to harvest that?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Cave guano was a really important source of saltpeter.
So you're literally digging shit out of a cave to feed the war machine.
Yeah, I don't like caves.
No, it does not seem like a good industry to be
in a
involved.
cave in Laos once, and it's like, I don't ever want to go back to a cave after that. Caves are ugly. They look better in movies, but no. And so the cannons are developing really fast, and they become creatures of legend. They become sort of like the dragons of the time, and they're often called that. I mean, and they come into Central European religious wars really early on, like the Hussite Wars in the 1420s. They first have war wagons with the supplies for the cannon, and then the cannon would be dragged in the back. And this is field artillery beginning to develop. The gunpowder is developing faster and faster. It's being more effective. And, you know, you get the cannons developing to the point where they only explode and kill the gunners, you know, maybe one time out of 10, which is totally acceptable for most of the people who are not on the gun crews. And then they develop into these giant things that enter European folklore in the 15th century. There's one called, I'm sure I'm pronouncing it wrong, like Dolgret, which something like Mad Greta. There's a Bruegel painting about Dolgret, because she's a famous folklore figure. She was supposedly so tough that she goes down into hell and scares the devil and his minions out of it. And the English version of that is Mad Meg. And you get all these giant cannons named after that. The other innovations that you would expect, shells are in place, explosive shells rather than just giant boulders by 1440. And then, of course, the events that signal in traditional history the end of the Middle Ages in Europe, the fall of Constantinople. There's a really interesting story about cannons there. there was a Hungarian named Orban, which is rather an odd coincidence because there's a Hungarian named Orban now who actually runs the country.
Yeah.
And this Orban was, in the parlance of their times, a Wallachian, and he was working as a metallurgist and a cannon smith in Constantinople in 1450, and he said, hey, I can make you some really magnificent cannons in a whole new league, but the Byzantine remnant had no money, had no nothing by that point. Constantine the 11th just said, I've got no money, and by the way, I'm scheduled to die fighting on the walls to the illustrious memory of every nerd in history who reads about this in a couple of years from now, so no, I can't help you. So Orban then goes to the Turks and says, I make cannons. I'm really good at it. I can blast those walls down for you. He builds a giant gun at Adrianople, siege of a disastrous battle for the Romans centuries earlier. It gets dragged by dozens of oxen all the way to the walls of Constantinople, and it just starts blasting the walls down. And that's how Constantine the 11th met his destiny fighting on... I read this when I was a kid, just an illustration in an encyclopedia somewhere. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine the 11th, died fighting on the walls. Oh, God, that was so cool. That was my whole ambition, die fighting on the walls. It probably wasn't really so nice in reality, especially because he probably had a family inside the walls, and it just don't bear thinking about. But they use this thing called the Dardanelles gun, 16 tons, 27 feet long, and there's a famous description of it by an Ottoman soldier who said, and when it had caught fire, faster than you can say it, there was just a terrifying roar and a violent shaking of the ground beneath, and for a great distance around, and a din such as never been heard, then a monstrous thundering and an awful explosion and a flame that illuminated everything around and scorched it, propelled the stone ball powerfully out, projected with incredible force and power. The stone struck the wall, which it immediately shook and demolished, and it was itself shattered into many fragments. And that was sort of like the end of the line for one form of warfare, because the walls of Byzantium were a legend. They weren't supposed to be pierceable. Soon after that, other developments, mortars, meaning you can sit outside the city walls and not fire at the walls, fire over the walls, and destroy what's in the city. And at the same time, miniaturization, a shoulder stock gets added, because you can imagine it wasn't much fun to fire these early hand cannons when there was no stock. You could probably fire them once and then wait 6 months for your shoulder to heal. But the stock helps with that. And they fire faster. There's a case around this time, the late 15th century, of a gunner who was forced to make a long penitential pilgrimage because his comrades thought he had made a pact with the devil because he could fire his gun, his cannon, 3 times a day. And that just seemed unnatural. That was not right. So soon there's a massive explosion. Remember, there was 3 centuries of high Middle Ages where there's not a lot of innovation militarily. And then in the 15th century, things are happening very, very fast, leading up to the Italian wars where, well, I can just recommend that you see Profession of Arms by Olmi, because it involves Italian raiders on chevauchés who have developed armor so good that it can protect you from hand cannon. And there are apparently no real artillery in this German force which is invading down into Italy. But one trader provides them with, what is it called? I think a serpentine, a long, narrow piece of artillery. And that changes the whole character of the battle.
So you mentioned sieges and how the middle-aged siege was that conduct was ended by this innovation in artillery. By the time we get to the 30 Years' War, sieges become the most common sort of form of military conflict, more so than battles. And both the 30 Years' War and the 80 Years' War, which is happening before and at the same time, are largely a series of these sieges. What was it like to be in one of these early modern sieges, and what were the techniques for fighting one?
Yeah, I've thought about that, and I've read some accounts of this, but you just have to imagine the misery, just incredible misery. Before the army approaches to lay siege to your town, usually the people from the countryside will be driven in, and they'll add to the crowding. And then it depends on how long it takes you to starve or be swarmed. And obviously we're leading up to things like the storming of Magdeburg, in which everybody's slaughtered, but that isn't exactly the norm. They die, but they're not slaughtered. It's more like Tigray right now, We didn't actually kill them, We just kind of cut off aid and ended communications, and they just happened to die. So during the 100 Years' War, for example, there's a siege. I forget which city in France is being besieged by the English. Oh, yeah, I think it's Rouen. Yeah, okay. And the food situation inside becomes so terrible that they eat first the horses, then the dogs, then the cats, and then they eat the mice. And at that point, the English, not generally known for their compassion in that war, allow thousands of peasants from the surrounding areas who are terrorized into the city. And the Rouen authorities then force them back out into the ditch between the fortifications and the English line surrounding the city. And on Christmas Day, an English priest comes out to offer them some food, and so they have a really nice Christmas. But then it gets to be like January 17th, and they're all dying. They can't get into Rouen. They can't really escape from around Rouen, and they're just going to die. So what you're doing is basically reducing the morale and the health, and eventually trying to end the lives of everybody inside. You're also probably making a deal with whoever the ruler is, but that depends a lot on local arrangements. There's also the factor of disease. You can really hope for disease. There are unreliable accounts of people throwing diseased carcasses into besieged towns. I can't swear to that. But then you also have, as a besieger, the problems of money and being attacked from outside. I mean, if these people have any friends in the larger world, they're going to try to raise an army and relieve the siege. That's what Joan was doing with Orléans a lot of the time. And you have to worry about that. So really, a lot of sieges involve making fortifications with two sides, one facing the city and one facing outward, to defend your siege lines against any attempt to relieve the city. And there are probably negotiations going on at the same time. Most cities in Europe it's a really well-watered area, so most people have water. When they don't, the city has usually provided cisterns or something. In other parts of the world, it's not like that at all, but in Europe, there's plenty of water. So food becomes the issue, and disease, and morale in general. And how long? And then money. How long can you afford to pay your soldiers? Because as the 15th and 16th century progress, many countries, the better, more centrally organized countries like England and Sweden, begin to have national levies, which are actually paid on something like a regular basis, fed on something like a regular basis. And that's a problem for a besieging general. You got to handle all those people. You've got to manage them. You've got to keep them employed. If you've got mercenaries in your party, you've got to keep them incentivized, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
You have to allow a certain level of looting usually, and that can cause problems too, because they can get ambushed out there, or they can start talking to people on the other side and start making deals. It's basically a really ugly, treacherous form of warfare. And of course, the children die first. Children always die first in a siege.
Right. So just on the discussion of mercenaries and the new put into mercenaries, I mean, just to be clear about how much of a difference that would be, you talk about, money as a limiting factor. When we're thinking about the Middle Ages warfare and the system of, calling up your barons and whatever, the idea is at that time, your army would be self-funded. Like the people you called up are basically supporting themselves, correct? As opposed to a top-down payment distribution plan, which is another, significant change of this era.
Yeah, but I think you do have a responsibility for them. Not that, I think a lot of early medieval leaders lay awake at night worrying if all their forces were well fed. But if they're really being badly handled, they'll just start running for the woods. So you have to supply them with something. But loyalty is a tricky business. I think most of us have read Machiavelli in first year history, and he's very anti-mercenary, and so we all think from the history of the Italian city-states, mercenaries are stupid, mercenaries don't work, but mercenaries did work a lot of the time. And in Italy, it was more like they had become the entire force, because Italian city-states, because they didn't have the feudal organization. If you're a city-state, how are you a knight in a city? It doesn't work. Those city-states were bankers. There's, if you know the Accursed Kings books, there's a really strong context in those books, contrast between the character of this Genoese banker and the family of the woman he's in love with, who are French knights. The French knights consider him a complete inferior because he has no family background in their terms. But at the same time, they live in this giant shed in the middle of nowhere, and they've got no money, and their horses are about to die. But they still won't let him marry her. And to him, because the Italian cities were far, far more advanced than most of Northern Europe, it's deeply puzzling to him. Like, what are these people basing their pride on? They eat oatmeal every day, and yet they're snotty with me. So the Italian cities didn't think of themselves as being lacking in morale because they hired mercenaries. They thought it was a sign, basically, that we got better things to do.
So then let's move on into the actual 30 Years' War. And I think maybe the figure that we can use to best look at the developments of this era is Gustavus Adolphus. And, he is one of the most popular figures from the time. Everybody likes hearing about this, Swede upending the entire conflict by, trampling in from the north with his superior organization and use of the current technologies. But I guess my question is, what did Gustavus Adolphus actually do? Is he everything that he's cracked up to be in popular history? Is there a revisionist take on him? What were his innovations, and how good was he when you rate him against the greats?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't claim to have any especially insightful answers, but I have looked into this preparing for the show, and it's a really interesting question because, first of all, when you look at war nerdery around Europe, there's totally unashamed, enthusiastic war nerdery among the Anglos, even though we have quite a lot to be ashamed of if we were going to bother with shame. But there's a real caution among the other nations of Northern Europe, even though they have really fascinating and illustrious histories too. And yet this changes where Gustavus Adolphus comes in. He is, as far as I can tell, something like a patriotic hero for Swedes, even in the 21st century. And this affects his reputation. It might even be that he's a patriotic hero for Protestants, but then you'd have to believe that there were Protestants in Northern Europe. And I don't know. It's like the one part of the world where Protestants aren't doing very well. Everywhere else, they're in Ethiopia, in Argentina, in Brazil, everywhere they're doing really, really well, but not in Northern Europe. So I don't know quite what leads to this patriotism, but it's clear that it's there. And I think it may have given him an inflated reputation because he did have a well-organized army, and but it was a Swedish army. It didn't depend entirely on him. I mean, Sweden was fighting in Poltava in the heart of Ukraine, and then in Narva, in what is now Estonia, there's a beautiful scene, forget where, of a Swedish unit of pikemen just marching in complete silence into a fortress in Narva and just sort of relentlessly marching through it and skewering anybody who got in their way. So I think there was a feeling in Sweden of something like egalitarian militarism that inspired a lot of magnificent campaigns, but I don't know that he deserves all the credit for that. And the strangest thing is, when I was looking at this, preparing for the show, nobody wants to talk about Wallenstein. I mean, Wallenstein did things that are astonishing. I mean, he gets dismissed by this idiot of an emperor, and he's middle-aged and gouty, and he says, the hell with it then. Okay, fine. Then he gets reappointed. He forms an army of over 100,000 men, multiple nations. And Schiller, in his plays about Wallenstein, emphasizes this, like, how do you think this army stays together? Why do you think the Croats don't kill the Bavarians? Why do you think the Bavarians don't kill the Franconians? Why do you... and it's Wallenstein, and he seems to get no credit for this at all. He's a very unfashionable figure at the moment, which I don't understand, because he's really remarkable. Because after this, he recreates an army in a few weeks, leads it into battle, and at Alta Festa defeats Gustavus Adolphus pretty decisively. And then by marching more intelligently than Gustavus Adolphus moves into the southwest of Germany, hoping to winter there. And then he discovers that Wallenstein has moved north to cut his supply line from Sweden. And as a result, he has to march his troops, forced march, 17 days straight, up to the Battle of Lutzen, where he's destroyed and killed. To me, that's pretty magnificent. Not just the strategic skills, but the organizational skills. Astonishing. And I don't know why he doesn't get more credit.
I think part of it might be the very fact that his reputation is associated with the Schiller plays and the 19th century German romantics. And for some reason, the Germans don't like to talk about those guys and their inspirations much anymore.
That's really true of Germans. It's a shame. You have to read history in a mighty strange way to read Auschwitz back onto them. But that seems to be a popular thing at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of diverges from the topic of just simple war, but I think that is one of the things that I've thought of a lot doing this series, is that it's not so simple when you're looking at the straight ahead at the conflict of the 30 Years' War to say, like, there is the good guys and the bad guys here. It's as Matt was just alluding to, trying to read on some kind of German nationalism to any of the specific, I think that happens to Bernard Saxe-Weimar a little later too. Yeah. But that all seems like 20th looking at the conflict through 20th century glasses. When, I mean, you could just as much say that Gustavus was leading his army on some kind of nationalist crusade or whatever.
Well, he's certainly absolutely trying to create a Swedish empire.
Yes,
and trying to accumulate more foreign territories as fast as he can. And then you're dealing with a war in which the overwhelming mass of the civilians who were massacred are Germans. They're the victims in most of this war. And everybody else is involved. The French are sending money. Richelieu is just doing anything he can to keep the war going and to keep the Swedes messing up the German lands as much as he can. Everybody else is involved here, and it's mighty strange. I was thinking of who gets the credit for the 30 Years' War, and I was thinking, Charles I of England because he stayed out, maybe. I mean,
well, and look how that turned out for him.
Yeah, well, for him, yes, but for them, it turned out pretty well.
Well, you were just talking about the real deprivations of the war were visited upon the German people. So maybe let's stick on that for a second. And we discuss in our main series, and you mentioned the siege and eventual atrocities at Magdeburg. And so I was just wondering, and maybe you don't have anything on this, but do you have any sense of how during this time, if there was any developing, sense of the idea, the very earliest ideas of a war crime, or, how civilian casualties were absorbed into the concept of war making around then? And, maybe the answer is that it still wasn't even really a factor in the way people thought about making war during the 17th century.
I think it was a factor in an amorphous way. I don't think anybody tried to codify it to the extent that people did after 1945. And I don't think that's been all that much of a success either, because somehow exceptions keep getting made for whoever's on top. But I think, frankly, the national identity phase of the West, if there is such a thing, is pretty recent. Before that, it was a world divided into Christendom, the Ummah, the Muslim world, and the pagans. And there were a lot of pagans to the northeast, even in the High Middle Ages, or at least they thought there were. So they tended to be a little less squeamish about massacres committed by Christian armies on non-Christians, such as the Jerusalem massacre in 1099, the Frankish invaders, mostly French, some German and English and others, break into Jerusalem, kill Muslims and Jews. There was a memory of that, and it made some people flinch, but I think it also made some people feel that it was a triumphal moment in what was a long, long war between faiths. And when your faith was able to do something as devastating as this, it was a sign from your God that that your God was winning. So that when the Albigensians in the 13th century became formally identified as heretics, that is, non-Christians, it's kind of an Islamic State way of looking at things, very, very common. Then they were prey. They were killable, and the idea of wiping out the Cathars in southern France was completely legitimate. But when somebody was identified as a fellow Christian, then there was a certain amount of squeamishness about that. It still happened, like the beginning of the 14th century, the Matins of Bruges, the Flemish forces massacre thousands of French soldiers who were asleep. I think it was like there was a reaction to that, but it was more like, oh, come on, man, they were sleeping. Let them wake up, let them put on their stuff, and then you can kill them. But there was a trial for a kind of war crime in 1474. One Peter von Hagenach was put up before a tribunal of the Holy Roman Empire because he was supposed to be in charge of preventing, quote, unruly behavior. And God knows what unruly behavior meant. I mean, a trail of corpses 10 miles long, I'm sure. But they took it seriously enough that he was condemned to death and he was beheaded. Gustav Adolf is famous for having put some constraints on his troops, though there's a mixed story about that. I don't know. Where did the whole Schweden trunk come from? I mean, how come they invented their own torture if they were being so restrained? I don't know. But basically, killing, unless it can be defined within a just war, and that includes both Protestant and Catholic definitions, does constitute a deadly sin. So, yeah, I think there was an awareness of atrocities as atrocities, but there was probably not this sense that every time you burn peasants' houses and rape their families and slit their throats, a terrible crime was committed. It was more that war was hell, as Sherman would say, and whether an army occupied a village, whether it was friendly or hostile, you were out of luck if that army passed through.
Yeah, the closest thing you have is people inventing the idea of just war, like Hugo Grotius, who's a Dutch diplomat during the period. He starts promulgating ideas that justify the war, and if you are engaged in a just war, then what happens sort of happens. Like necessity is now determining events, and you can't really be held to any standard in individual cases. Yeah. I mean, what is it? Violence wielded by a righteous authority for the greater good. So, yeah, if the cause is just, then what happens is just. It was, and one thing that Mark Ames has been arguing, to go a bit afield in the case of Ukraine, is that Americans in particular seem to forget that when the Nuremberg trials started formulating the conceptual framework for their verdicts, aggression, starting a war, was the big crime because that leads to all the other crimes. So that the big crime in Ukraine is going to war. That was a horrible, evil thing. So yeah, a lot of it comes down to that same mode of thinking. Even at Nuremberg, like, we accept implicitly that if there's a war, horrible things are going to happen. So you better be right in starting one.
Well, then let's move maybe towards the end of our era of conflict. We, kind of say that the last major battle of the 30 Years' War, the last major armed conflict, is at Rocroi. And, we mentioned in the main series that the, as Wedgwood says, the battle marker at Rocroi is the graveyard of the tombstone of the Spanish Empire, and that's one of the last times you see things like tercios put in place. So I was just wondering what your take on when this era of warfare kind of ends, or how it transitions into the next phase of warfare after this.
Yeah. Well, I know that a lot of people who are much more learned than I am say that something changed at the end of the 30 Years' War, that there was a kind of wave of disgust in the European elite, to the point that, Annibale, who's been a frequent guest of ours and is a brilliant guy, says that Europe sort of finally reached the point that China had reached after the period of warring states long before, which was, don't talk about religion. If you have to talk about religion, at least don't kill anybody over it. I think that was a big change, and it worked out in some parts of Europe anyway. To me, what follows is the discovery of the rest of the world and a double standard that exists to this day, which is, if you did horrible things in places very far away from Europe, you're going to get away with them a lot better than if you did them in Europe. And obviously that worked to the advantage of the imperial powers, and it did not work at all to powers in Central Europe or the Mediterranean, who were cut off from that whole development.
I guess I would like to ask this question, just out of curiosity. So the type of warfare we're talking about, the artillery, the pike and shot, the cavalry that is occurring in Europe in the 17th century, how is that different from what's happening in China and India, in the Ottoman lands? Like, what is the military doctrine and tactics of that comparatively?
Yeah. Well, okay, that's a big question. I don't know. I'm not. That's over my head, beyond my pay grade. I think the big encounters between European armies and armies of those Indian and Chinese and other Asian cultures comes a bit later. But I will there. I'll tell you one thing. I was reading up on matchlocks and the development of the serpentine. The S-shaped thing that you touch to the flash pan to make your musket fire. And the amazing thing is, in 1904, Sir Francis Younghusband, that's his name, believe it or not.
Great.
One of those urban knights decides to invade Tibet. Why? I don't know. People have seriously argued that it was because the Raj was running out of places to win medals. I mean, you could only provoke the Pashtun into fighting you, so many times. So he invades Tibet, and the Tibetans are out of the world. They've been out of the world. They were once a very powerful empire, but that was 1,000 years ago, and they're out of the world now, and they don't know what's going on. So he encounters a group of men with 17th century matchlocks. And so, each of these firearms has a little burning fuse because you have to keep it burning. You don't have time to light it if you need to fire. And his troops have Martini rifles, very good repeating rifles. So he, to make the Tibetans stand down, orders his men in full view to shuck the one shell, out of their Martini rifles. And you can just imagine them giggling. And seeing this, the Tibetan soldiers, who have no idea of a repeating rifle, then douse the flames on their matchlocks. And then the Sir Francis Younghusband's troops, on order, aim, fire, and kill all of them. So there is a massive difference between the 17th century weapons and the constant evolution that has been going on, not just in Europe, but in Europe and parts of the world that have had the bad luck to encounter Europe in common conflict. But there are other parts of the world that are going to have to learn that lesson in a very hard way.
All right. Well, I think that we will leave it there for this episode. John, thank you so much for bringing your war nerdery to Hell on Earth.
It was fun.
Well, can you tell people
fun in hell?
Yes. Can you tell people where to find? Yes. where to find more War Nerd if they would like some.
Yeah, Radio War Nerd is on Patreon. I always mispronounce it as Patreon, I guess. Yeah, we just had an interview with Seymour Hersh, which helped to make us even more unpopular than before. Yeah, speaking of hell on earth, interviewing Seymour Hersh. Wow, he's a scary guy. Yeah, you can find us on Patreon. I just put out a newsletter today about the concept of jihad in Frank Herbert and why
Great.
and how it came out of the Bay Area in the 1960s. So yeah, we talk about this and that and the gall-darned other thing.
Great. Well, we love War Nerd here. Please go find them and subscribe. John, thank you so much.
My pleasure.